Hi, so this is a re-recording of the first week's lecture. Um, if it's the case that you cannot hear this, I know that it's the case that other people can hear it, and I know that it's the case that I can hear the first one. So my guess is that you need to play around with your sound settings, or you need to listen to it on a different computer. All right, well, in any case, this lecture is on validity, invalidity, soundness, and unsoundness. These are the central notions of logic that we're going to be talking about. I should also note that if you did get the first one to work, right, or you were able to understand it at least, it's not going to be the case that what I say this time is exactly the same. I don't have a script, right, I merely have an outline that I'm working from. Right, so you could fruitfully listen to both, perhaps, right? The main information will be the same. Perhaps I'll riff on some different things this time. Okay, but anyway, let's get started. All right, so the central notion, the first one rather that we need to talk about, right, is the notion of an argument. Right, so logic, the class that we're in, or the field of study that we're going to be studying, right, studies arguments. Right, and the main sort of goal is to distinguish between the good arguments and the bad arguments. Of course, there are a lot of different ways that arguments can be good or bad, right? So some arguments might be good in that they're compelling, right? And some arguments might be bad in that they're uncompelling or not compelling. But the sort of notion that we want to study in logic, right, is a formal notion. It's called validity, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But before we do that, it's important for us to get clear on what arguments are or aren't. Right? So for our purposes, an argument isn't like a shouting match or a disagreement between two people or parties or anything like that. Rather, we're going to give this sort of mathematical account of what they are. Right? So for our purposes, an argument is a collection of statements, some of which are designated as premises and one of which is designated as the conclusion. So this will make more sense if we say something about what premises and conclusions are. Right? If you don't know what those are, then I take it this means nothing. Right, so an argument, right, sort of wants you, or the point of an argument rather, is to get you to believe something on the basis of some other things. Right, so the conclusion of an argument is what the argument wants you to believe, right, and the premises are like the evidence given for that conclusion. Right, so I can characterize premises and conclusions in terms of one another. Right, so the premises support the conclusion, and the conclusion of an argument is what's supported by the premises. Right. So another important point here is that we need some sort of statement that tells us that the premises are supposed to support the conclusion, and we'll come back to that next week. But for now, the important point is that an argument is a collection of statements, some of which are designated as premises, and one of which is designated as the conclusion. So beyond that, we have four central notions of logic, right? Validity, invalidity, soundness, and unsoundness. So I said earlier that logic is the formal study, or the study of formal features of arguments that make them good. Those correspond to the first two notions, validity and invalidity. Those are purely formal notions, and we'll say more about what that means as the course goes on. In fact, it's going to be our goal to characterize validity and invalidity. And we're going to see that there are different ways that we can do that, right? And corresponding to those different ways are different ways in which arguments can be good or bad. Okay. The way to think about soundness and unsoundness, and we'll go on to define these in a moment, but an initial way to think about them is that there's something like validity, this is the case of soundness, validity plus truth of the premises. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But the important thing to take away here is that there are four central notions of logic. We're going to be spending most of our time focusing on the first two, validity and invalidity, but the four ones are validity, invalidity, soundness, and unsoundness. Right, so the first central notion that we're going to talk about, and this is really central, right? This is the most important, most central notion of logic, right, is validity. So it's super important that you memorize these definitions, right? Because I'm going to ask you about these definitions. I'm going to ask you to reproduce these definitions. You're going to have to answer questions about these definitions and how they relate to other definitions. So if you don't memorize this, you're just going to be in a terrible situation when it comes time to doing any sort of work, right? So I can't stress strongly enough how important it is that you memorize these definitions. And beyond that, not only memorizing them, but understanding them, right? So the sort of memorization stuff falls on you, right? So maybe you should write these out or read them over and over again, or something, whatever it takes for you to memorize these. But understanding what they mean, right? That's the point of the lectures and the readings and all of that, and like working with the definitions. But I think it's more important to begin with that you actually have these memorized. So that's one thing you can do this week, right? That's not sort of graded homework or anything like that. But in any case, let's begin with the notion of validity. So our definition is this: an argument is valid if and only if. So sometimes I'll abbreviate that IFF. It's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. So taking a step back to the previous slides, right? Remember that an argument is a collection of statements, some of which are designated as premises and one of which is designated as a conclusion, right? And there's supposed to be this sort of connection between the premises and the conclusion. Right, so what's important here, right, with the notion of validity is that there's supposed to be this connection between the premises and the conclusion, such that if the premises are true, right, the conclusion has to be true as well. So let's read the definition of validity again. An argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. So what this tells us, here's one thing it tells us. So suppose that an argument's valid, right? So if it's valid, then if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true at the same time. Or equivalently, if an argument is valid, if its premises are true, right, it's not the case that its conclusion is false. Or here's a slightly stronger reading, right? If an argument is valid, then if its premises are true, it's not possible for its conclusion to be false at the same time, right? So one way to think about this is that validity is this sort of connection between the premises and the conclusion, right? It's a connection of necessitation, right? So the truth of the premises necessitates the truth of the conclusion in a valid argument. One way to think about this is that the truth of the premises makes the conclusion true, right, in a valid argument. Another way to think about it is that in a valid argument, the conclusion, in some sense, right, is contained in the premises. This is a really central notion that we'll be making clearer as the course goes on, but maybe it's something to keep in your back pocket for now. So before moving on, I'm just going to say the definition of validity once again, and I can do this with my eyes closed. An argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Right, so I had my eyes closed. You can only hear my voice, so you can't tell, but trust me, they were closed. I've got these memorized, and again, it's gonna save you a lot of headache if you just memorize these to begin with. Right, so the next central notion is going to be very easy to memorize, but you'd be surprised how many people don't memorize it, and then they just like mess everything up. But this is the notion of invalidity, right? So we'll say that an argument is invalid if and only if it's not valid, right? So if an argument is valid, right, then if its premises are true, its conclusion has to be true as well. So an invalid argument, right, is an argument that if its premises are true, its conclusion doesn't have to be true, right? So this isn't to say that there aren't invalid arguments with true premises and a true conclusion, right? It's only to say that in an invalid argument, right, if the premises are true, it's not the truth of the premises that makes the conclusion true, right? So the premises might be true and the conclusion just true as a matter of accident, right, rather than this sort of necessitation between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. Right, so the next central notion is that of soundness, right? So I'll give you the definition again, memorize it. So an argument is sound if and only if, 1, it's valid, and 2, its premises are true, right? So soundness we can think of as validity plus true premises, right? So if we have a valid argument, right, and its premises are true, right, then its conclusion has to be true, right? So think about the definition of valid again, right? An argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Suppose that we have an argument that's valid with true premises. Well, if the premises are true and the argument's valid, right, then we know that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well, so it follows that the conclusion is true, right? So an argument is sound, right, if and only if first, it's valid, and second, its premises are true. Right? So soundness is validity plus true premises. Actually, one thing to note here before going on, right? So when we were talking about validity and invalidity, right, we didn't say anything about whether or not the argument's premises or conclusions were actually true or actually false, right? It was merely a conditional claim, right? So if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true in a valid argument, right? And if the premises are true, the conclusion might be false in an invalid argument. But they're merely conditional claims, right? We're not saying that the premises are in fact true or they are in fact false, right? So that's why we need this notion of soundness, right? So it's not only validity, but it's making good on the first part of the conditional statement, right? The if the premises are true bit, right? So an argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true. All right, so next we have unsoundness. And unsoundness is to soundness as invalidity is to validity, right? So that is to say, just as invalidity is the claim, or an argument is invalid just in case it's not valid, right? An argument is unsound if and only if it's not sound, right? So again, very easy to memorize, but let's think about this for a moment. So what are some ways that an argument could be unsound? Well, going back to our definition of soundness, right? An argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true, right? So there are two ways for an argument to be unsound. First, its premises are false, right? And second, it's invalid, right? So if we have an invalid argument, right, then we know that we have an unsound argument, right? And if we have an argument with false premises, right, even if just one premise is false, we know that the argument's unsound. All right, so by way of review here, in your notes, you might want to pause me and write these down. Again, you have to memorize these. Here are our four central notions, and I'll say them again just so you can hear what's hopefully my crystal clear voice. So validity, an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Invalidity, an argument is invalid if and only if it's not valid. Soundness, an argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true. And then finally, unsoundness, an argument is unsound if and only if it is not sound. All right. So what I want to do now is talk about how these central notions are related to one another, if at all. So I'm going to give you some bolded claims, right? Some claims that are in boldface print, right? And then I'm going to try to explain to you why they are true, right? So this first one is the claim that all sound arguments are valid, right? So that's true. And why is that? Well, think about the definition of soundness or sound, right? So an argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true. So we're told that all sound arguments are valid. Well, this just follows from the definition of soundness, right? So an argument is sound only if, right? Not only if, but also only if it's valid, right? So all sound arguments are valid. So now we have all invalid arguments are unsound. So again, this is true, and the question is why? Well, again, we're going to appeal to the definition of soundness, right? An argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true, right? So if the argument is invalid, we know that it's unsound, right? Given the definition of unsound this time, right? So an argument is unsound if and only if it is not sound. All right, so sorry. Here's a claim, any argument with a false conclusion is unsound. Here's a question, well, why? So this one we have to appeal to the definition of sound, invalid, and unsound. Right, so suppose that we have an argument with a false conclusion. Well, think about the definition of soundness, right? So an argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true. And then think about the definition of valid, right? So an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Right, so we're told that an argument is sound if and only if it's valid, and second, its premises are true, right? So suppose that the argument has a false conclusion, right? So we can conclude that it's not the case that it's valid and its premises are true. Why is that? Well, if it were valid, right, and its premises were true, then its conclusion would have to be true as well, right? So we know that the argument's unsound. All right, here's a claim. There are valid arguments with false conclusions. Okay, so what's important here, again, is that the definition of validity is only this sort of conditional statement, right? So if the premises are true, right, then the conclusion has to be true as well, right? But it doesn't tell us that the argument's premises are actually true, right? So I'm going to try to convince you with an example, right? So consider the following argument. If Clinton is the president, then Kane is the vice president. Clinton is not the president, therefore Kane is the vice president. So this is a valid argument, right? So if the premises were true, right, if it were the case that Clinton is the president, then Kane is the vice president, and Clinton is not the president, it would follow, right, that Kane is the vice president, rather. Right? So this is a valid argument. But note that the second premise isn't true, and neither is the conclusion, right? So this is an example of a valid argument with a false conclusion. So here's another example. If-then statements are sort of tricky, I find students think, at least initially. By the end of the course, you won't find them tricky at all. So here's one with either or, right? So either it's the case that 2 plus 2 is 5, or it's the case that 2 plus 2 is 6. It's not the case that 2 plus 2 is 6, therefore 2 plus 2 is 5. So in the definition of validity, right, this should strike you as a good argument or as a valid argument, right? So suppose it were the case that either A or B, and you're told that it's not the case that B, right? You could conclude safely, right, that A is the case, right? And that's the form of this argument. But of course, it's an argument with a false conclusion, right? So this is an example of a valid argument, right, with a false conclusion. So there are valid arguments with false conclusions. So now I want to ask some questions, right, and have you try to figure out the answers. So I'll read the question and then the answers, or possible answers rather, and then please pause me and try to answer them for yourself. So here's our first question. What can we conclude on the basis of the following information? A certain argument is valid and all of its premises are true. Right, so what we're supposed to be imagining here is that we have an argument, right, we know that it's valid, and we know that all of its premises are true. What can we conclude? So could we conclude that its conclusion is true, that it's sound, or none of the above? Well, here you have to appeal... Oh, actually, pause me. Okay, so I hope you paused me and gave that some thought. So here you have to appeal to the definition of sound, right? So, and also valid, right? So let's start with A. So on the basis of knowing that an argument is valid and all of its premises are true, can you conclude that the conclusion is true? Well, you can, right? So think about the definition of validity. An argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false. So we're supposed to be imagining an argument that's valid, right, with true premises or all true premises. So then we can conclude that its conclusion is true as well, right? Because if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true in a valid argument. Okay, so what about B? Can we conclude that the argument is sound? Well, here we need to appeal to the definition of soundness. An argument is sound if and only if, first, it's valid, and second, its premises are true. Well, the question tells us that the argument's valid and all of its premises are true, so it just follows from the definition of soundness very straightforwardly that the argument's sound. So we can conclude A and B, and by process of elimination, in the meaning of none of the above, we can conclude that C is not the case. What about this one? What can we conclude on the basis of the following information? A certain argument has true premises and a true conclusion. Can we conclude that it's valid, that it's sound, or none of the above? So pause me and give this some thought. Okay, so I hope you gave that some thought. It's good for you to actually practice this and try to do it rather than passively receiving the wisdom from me. Sorry, that was kind of a joke. But there's a very serious moral, right, which is that you should be trying to figure this out for yourself. All right, so suppose that we have a certain argument with true premises and a true conclusion. right? Can we conclude that it's valid or that it's sound or none of the above? Well, just knowing that the premises are true and the conclusion is true doesn't tell us that the argument's valid, right? As we mentioned earlier, right? It could just be sort of an accident that the premises are true and the conclusion is true as well, right? Merely having true premises and a true conclusion doesn't tell us that the conclusion is true because the premises are true, right? So we can't conclude that it's valid. Since we can't conclude that it's valid, we can't conclude that it's sound, right? Because an argument is sound if and only if first it's valid and second its premises are true. So we know that its premises are true, but we don't know that it's valid. So we can't conclude that it's sound, and then by process of elimination, we can rule out C. And here's a quick rundown of that last reasoning. So you should pause me and read this if you didn't follow it.